The road is open, the future is not.
The Last Feed War. Chapter 1. The War of the Chronically Online. For 134 years, humanity had been locked in a ruinous global conflict over a question so idiotic that later generations would struggle to believe their ancestors had died over it in serious numbers. The question was this: which platform was better, Facebook or TikTok? Not which system of government should rule mankind. Not which philosophy best honored the dignity of life. Not even whether pineapple belonged on pizza, a matter people had once argued with a level of passion that should have been treated as an omen. No. Civilization collapsed because one side believed identity was best expressed through long captions under blurry family photos, while the other believed all meaningful human communication should occur vertically in under 45 seconds, with music underneath it. From that disagreement came the burnings of the old suburbs, the siege of the sponsored coast, the great influencer purges, the moderation raids, the algorithm famines, and, most embarrassing of all, the emoji embargo of 2098, during which 3 million people nearly starved because both sides refused to trade grain with anyone still using the crying laughing face incorrectly. By the year 2158, the old nations were gone, replaced by two hostile civilizations that had each built their entire culture around the worst habits of their ancestral platforms. In the Western territories, the federated face ruled from colossal concrete cities called walls, where every public square contained giant glowing memory screens that reminded citizens what they had posted on that date 100 years ago, whether they wanted to know or not. Every birthday was mandatory, every opinion was cataloged, every meal was photographed before consumption by law, though most food now looked like wet insulation anyway. Citizens wore blue-gray uniforms with little reaction pins on the collar to indicate state-approved emotional tone. They believed history was sacred, community was everything, and no issue had ever truly been resolved until a middle-aged relative had written 6 paragraphs about it and ended with, "Just my thoughts." In the eastern sectors, the Tick Dominion pulsed in towers of black glass and shifting neon, a civilization powered almost entirely by speed, spectacle, and chemically sustained attention. Their leaders were called trends, and their authority lasted only as long as people cared. Streets flashed with moving light. Public announcements were delivered in hooks. Court rulings were condensed into 12-second clips with dramatic zooms. Their soldiers trained in synchronized intimidation formations because apparently even warfare now required choreography. Children learned rhetorical escalation before they learned fractions. The national anthem had been remixed 11,000 times, and 3 of those versions had briefly triggered riots. Between these two digital empires lay the scroll, a vast dead zone of blasted server farms, rusted drones, abandoned ad tech bunkers, and fields where nothing natural grew except tough gray weeds and the occasional very confused goat. It had once been farmland, then battlefield, then content backdrop, then battlefield again. No one living actually knew how the war had started. They only knew the legends. In blue schools, children were taught that the first tick forces had launched the Mockery Offensive, a campaign of weaponized dancing and mimetic disrespect so severe it shattered civilization's last remaining manners. In black schools, students learned that the Facebook regimes had begun the conflict by burying free expression beneath outdated rules, manipulative nostalgia, and 70-slide photo albums from vacations no one asked to see. Each side had holy archives. Each side had martyrs. Each side had documentaries narrated by voices so solemn and self-important you could practically hear them smelling their own importance. After 134 years, nobody questioned the premise anymore. People simply inherited rage the way earlier generations had inherited furniture. Chapter 2. Devon of the Walls. Devon Venn lived in New Concord, one of the largest Blue Archive cities where the skyline was dominated by monolithic remembrance towers and every transit station smelled faintly of static, printer dust, and old grief. He worked in Archive Reclamation Chamber 7, which sounded much more glamorous than it was. In practice, his job involved sitting under cold lights for 12 hours a day, examining damaged data drives recovered from the scroll and determining whether any of the contents could be repurposed for public morale. Weddings were useful. Baby photos tested well. Videos of backyard barbecues performed especially strongly among citizens over 40 and could be edited into patriotic montages about continuity, sacrifice, and enduring values. Footage of people enjoying ordinary life before the war was one of the state's most effective emotional tools, mostly because the public could no longer imagine what ordinary life had ever looked like without branding, surveillance, or sirens. Devon was quiet, observant, and careful in the way only a man could be who had survived adulthood in a society where every badly phrased thought might become a permanent record. He was not supposed to privately access archived media without authorization, but rules like that always assumed the human soul had no curiosity left in it. On slow nights, when the chamber supervisors drifted into administrative stupors and the camera angles were predictable, Devon would open old personal files and watch fragments of a civilization too casual to understand how miraculous it had been. A woman laughing in a kitchen while flour streaked her cheek. A grandfather struggling to fold a lawn chair. Someone filming a dog that refused to come inside during rain. A family arguing over directions in a minivan. A badly framed birthday song. Small things, forgettable things, deeply unfashionable things. Devon watched them with the secret ache of a man glimpsing proof that humanity had once spent meaningful time being ridiculous together in harmless ways. He had come to believe, though he would never say it aloud, that the old world might have been saved if more people had simply been forced to sit on back patios and discuss ribs instead of posting about civilization every 4 minutes. That, of course, was not a sanctioned historical perspective. Like most blue citizens, Devon had been raised to believe the Dominion was a civilization of empty-headed narcissists and chemically accelerated maniacs who communicated exclusively in dance threats and 17 layers of irony. He had seen the propaganda reels, black-clad figures jerking through weapon drills set to distorted music, trend priests shouting slogans into camera lenses, captured enemy devices full of filters that made everyone look like aggressively moisturized ghosts. Still, he found it difficult to summon proper hatred for people he had never met. He did not think this made him noble. Mostly, it made him tired. Hatred, in his experience, required spare emotional energy, and the Federated Face was not a society that left anyone much of that after forms, oaths, memory observances, compliance updates, and the annual 7-day argument season known as Civic Reflection Week. If Devon had one truly rebellious quality, it was this. He had begun to suspect that all large institutions eventually became deeply embarrassing if you looked at them long enough. Chapter 3. Quran of the Dominion. Far to the east, in the flashing black towers of Velocity 9, Quran Quill worked in sensory relevance optimization, which was the sort of department name a civilization invented when it wanted to avoid plainly admitting that it manufactured public mood for political convenience. Quran's job was to monitor emotional trend flows and identify which forms of content best sustained attention, outrage, loyalty, grief, or hunger. She knew what length of pause made viewers lean forward. She knew what sound profile generated anxiety in under 3 seconds. She knew that footage of an enemy soldier removing a helmet humanized too quickly unless intercut with threat graphics and dissonant percussion. She knew exactly how long an image of a crying child could remain on screen before people began to feel manipulated instead of galvanized, which, in fairness, was the sort of distinction that only mattered in a culture already so morally broken it had mistaken emotional calibration for governance. Quran was excellent at her work and hated that fact with a clean, private precision. In her off hours, she committed the ancient crime of seeking out long-form content. Not officially illegal exactly, but suspicious in the same way keeping a pet wolf in an apartment would be suspicious. She watched ancient lecture videos where nobody cut to anything for 6 straight minutes. She watched old documentaries with patient narration. She watched home videos where nothing happened except weather, conversation, waiting, and people being slightly bored in each other's company. Dominion citizens were taught that the blues were stagnant fossils clinging to dead memory because they were too frightened to evolve. Quran had always accepted that story at face value when she was younger, mostly because it sounded cool and because the state made rebellion seem stylish right up until the moment you tried it. But as she grew older, she found herself wondering whether the enemy's worst crime might simply be that they still remembered how to endure silence without turning it into a performance. In the Dominion, every second had to justify itself. Every thought had to land. Every face had to angle correctly toward the lens of history. Quran had come to suspect that if a society feared quiet this much, it was probably terrified of hearing itself think. Like Devon, she had grown weary of inherited certainty. Also like Devon, she did not imagine that personal skepticism would ever matter. Empires were not usually toppled by competent employees with private doubts and bad sleep. They were toppled by famine, corruption, invasion, or one truly catastrophic software update. As it happened, the universe had been quietly preparing Option 4. A drone storm over the scroll, triggered by overlapping reconnaissance sweeps, decaying orbital junk, bad weather, and the general principle that after a century of war, every machine on Earth had been patched by at least 6 idiots and 1 accountant, lit the dead zone with fire. Buried beneath the ruins of a pre-war relay station, old systems woke. Emergency power flickered on, ancient doors unsealed. Deep sensors began broadcasting a signal that neither side recognized but both assumed must be of enormous strategic importance. Blue Command dispatched a covert recovery unit. Black Command did the same. Both teams entered the ruins with absolute confidence in their own superiority. This decision immediately killed almost everyone involved, which did make the surviving reports difficult to file. Chapter 4. Enemies in a Basement. Devon entered the old relay station through a collapsed service tunnel with 1 power cell left in his pulse rifle, 3 cracked ribs, and the profound irritation of a man who had been promised a precision recovery mission and instead received a guided tour of subterranean explosions. Quran came in from the opposite side by way of a ventilation shaft that had clearly not been inspected since democracy was still pretending to work. She dropped into the central chamber half-deaf, covered in dust, and already pointing a sidearm at the first moving silhouette she saw. For 3 seconds they stood frozen in the amber dark, both armed, both exhausted, both instantly recognizable as the enemy from the shape of uniform, insignia, and sheer institutional posture. Devon saw the black tactical weave, the sleeve interface, the Dominion throat glyph. Karen saw the blue archive insignia, the memory tag band at the wrist, and the expression of a man who looked like he had spent his whole life reading terms and conditions against his will. They raised weapons. They prepared to fulfill 134 years of historical expectation. Then the station lights clicked on in stages, and a terminal behind them chimed with almost offensively cheerful politeness. Across the largest surviving screen bloomed a message in old-world formatting that neither of them trusted because it looked far too normal for anything good to follow. Emergency archive access restored. Civilian network dispute mediation logs available. Karen blinked first. "What in the sponsored hell is that?" she said, because every great turning point in history deserves at least one line that sounds slightly stupid in retrospect. Devon did not lower his weapon, but he glanced over with a frown. "Pre-war systems," he muttered, "or a very elaborate trap by someone with a nostalgia problem." Another screen lit up with a file heading. Platform interoperability/corporate liability/April 18th, 2024/status. Unresolved. They looked at the date, then at each other. Neither was an expert in ancient chronology, but both knew 2024 was old enough that people back then still had functioning oceans and believed a software outage counted as a difficult afternoon. "Lower it," Karan said. "You lower yours," Devon replied. Because history enjoys symmetry, they both did. The station required dual biometric input, presumably because someone in the long-dead emergency planning office had once believed rival parties might cooperate in a crisis. This turned out to be the most unrealistic thing either of them had encountered all day. Still, the console accepted their palms, and the archive began to unfold. Thousands of files surfaced in compressed directories, executive emails, engineering reports, legal memos, public statements, draft corrections, moderation logs, conference recordings, and enough panicked internal communication to suggest that the old world had in fact been run exactly the way everyone secretly feared it had been run, by overpaid adults sending frantic messages while claiming to have everything under control. At first, each of them searched for vindication. Devon looked for evidence of Dominion sabotage. Quran hunted proof of deliberate blue suppression. But the further they dug, the less the material resembled a grand ideological betrayal, and the more it resembled the digital equivalent of someone dropping a birthday cake face first into a live electrical panel. Chapter 5. Crossed Wires. The origin of the feed war, as it turned out, was neither philosophical nor military. It was bureaucratic, stupid, and painfully on brand for the species that had managed to invent both antibiotics and comment sections. On April 18, 2024, a third-party ad analytics vendor deployed a faulty update across multiple major social platforms. This update scrambled content tagging systems, corrupted account associations, cross-posted internal notes, and mislabeled huge quantities of media. Family photos were briefly attached to extremist accounts. Dance videos got tagged as political threats. Memorial pages displayed advertisements for patio furniture. Misinformation warnings appeared on banana bread recipes. Live streams of city council meetings were recommended to teenagers trying to learn eyeliner. For 6 hours, the internet suffered a full-body hallucination. The public panicked. Executives panicked. Governments panicked. The news panicked so aggressively it nearly achieved escape velocity. Then came the message that doomed civilization. A junior crisis manager at an outside subcontractor wrote an internal note intended for a private executive chain. The note was simple. This looks like a mapping issue, not an attack. Probably just crossed wires between FB/TK vendor layers. Need calm before public statement. On any sane planet, this would have remained in a thread, been clarified, and been forgotten after several embarrassing meetings. But because the same malfunction was still shredding platform boundaries, the note escaped into public circulation in garbled forms across multiple networks. What millions of users saw were fragments: FB/TK attack, crossed wires, need calm before public statement. As if that were not enough, someone leaked part of an executive video call during which a sleep-deprived vice president shouted, "Who crossed over first?" A clipping error turned it into, "Who crossed over first?" which, if you already suspected conspiracy, sounded unhelpfully like an admission of hostile incursion. Another document mentioned executives entering the war room, which in common office language meant a conference room with stale coffee and a bad speakerphone. But on an internet already vibrating with paranoia sounded like open mobilization. The rest happened because humanity had spent years training itself to react before understanding. Conspiracy channels amplified the garbled phrases. Political opportunists claimed proof of platform aggression. Governments weaponized confusion. Influencers declared allegiance because neutrality tested badly with their demographics. Commentators filled airtime with speculation because saying, "we don't know yet," had never once helped anyone's ratings. Armed groups formed around digital cultural identity lines that had already hardened long before the outage. Violence spread. Once people started dying, the original cause almost ceased to matter. Blood is a far more effective narrative engine than clarification. Corporations, panicking over liability and market collapse, buried evidence, issued contradictory statements, and funded private security operations that made everything incomparably worse. One draft from an early mediation council stated plainly that no intentional attack had occurred and immediate de-escalation was essential. That statement was never released. The servers carrying it were destroyed, the council dissolved, and within months the conflict had outgrown every institution that might have corrected it. In time, the original misunderstanding was buried beneath doctrine, then myth, then sanctity. For 134 years, people inherited a war that had begun because millions of adults saw the phrase "crossed wires" during a software meltdown and decided the most reasonable response was organized civilization-wide homicide. Karan stared at the screen for a long time, then made a sound halfway between a laugh and the beginning of a nervous breakdown. "So," she said, voice thin with disbelief, "my civilization was founded because some exhausted contractor basically wrote 'oops,' and the entire species chose violence." Devon kept reading, hoping desperately for a deeper explanation, a hidden act of sabotage, anything dignified enough to justify the dead. Instead, he found legal memos, risk reviews, and an unsent statement confirming exactly what the evidence already said. "Not just that," he murmured. It was also greed, fear, opportunism, propaganda, and the fact that nobody ever checks anything if outrage feels better. Karan rubbed dust from her face and laughed again, this time in full, miserable astonishment. I cannot believe my ancestors died in battle because they didn't understand office jargon. Devon glanced at another file, then closed his eyes briefly. Apparently, they also didn't understand that war room was just a conference room. Karan looked at him. We destroyed the planet over a meeting with stale coffee. Devon nodded once. That does seem to be the historical consensus. Yes. Chapter 6. Two people make the most inconvenient decision possible. The station alarms began to sound a new pattern, low and insistent. External motion sensors had detected inbound forces from both sides. Karen and Devon understood immediately what that meant. Their commands had survived long enough to triangulate the site and were now converging on the relay station. If the blue forces captured the archive alone, they would bury the truth and repackage selected fragments into a patriotic cautionary series with orchestral swells. If the Dominion secured it first, they would chop the evidence into weaponized clips, add dramatic transitions, and blame the blues anyway. If both arrived together, the archive would likely be destroyed in the crossfire, and history would remain exactly as the powerful preferred it: wrong, profitable, and emotionally useful. In practical terms, there was only one moral option left, which also happened to be the option most likely to get them both killed. We broadcast it, Devon said. Karan did not hesitate. To everyone, she replied, which is the kind of thing people say just before reality develops a vendetta against them. They moved with the astonishing speed of two competent professionals who had finally found something more meaningful than their job descriptions. Karan rerouted surviving transmission arrays through ancient emergency bands. Devon compressed and authenticated the recovered files as fast as the old station would allow. They argued the whole time in the sharp, efficient way that suggested they might have become excellent co-workers in another life if not for the inherited apocalypse. Karen wanted the raw video clips first, because people trusted faces more than documents. Devon wanted the original text logs included, because raw footage without context was how the species had gotten here in the first place. They compromised by uploading everything they could and accepting that no perfect truth package had ever existed in human history. Dust shook from the ceiling. Somewhere above them came the distant impacts of explosives and collapsing steel. How long? Devon asked. Karen checked the signal stability and grimaced. 90 seconds, maybe less if either side starts jamming. Devon stared at the progress bar with the expression of a man who had already spent too much of life watching systems crawl. Civilization ends in stupidity and is now being saved by a loading icon, he muttered. I hate that. Same, Karan said, but keep hating it faster. Then she did the thing that changed everything. Instead of transmitting the files alone, she switched the old relay camera online and dragged Devon into frame beside her. The lens flickered alive, grainy and dim. Together they stood in amber emergency light, covered in dust, wearing enemy insignia, looking very much like what they were. Two overworked survivors who had discovered their entire world was built on an administrative misunderstanding. Karan spoke first, and Devon noticed immediately that her public voice was different from the sleek, clipped cadence of Dominion broadcasts. It was slower now, human, tired. If you're receiving this, she said, listen all the way through before somebody edits me into a villain montage. Devon almost laughed, which under the circumstances felt clinically inappropriate. Karan continued, introducing herself and plainly stating what she had found. Then Devon did the same. They took turns, simple and direct, explaining that the founding event of the war had not been an attack but a catastrophic technological failure amplified by panic, manipulation, and institutional cowardice. Karan held up the archive shard in one hand and said, You have inherited rage from people who never bothered to verify the original post. Devon added, You have been taught enemies where there should have been neighbors. Karan looked straight into the lens. The man beside me is not what I was told he was. Devon, after one brief breath, said, The woman beside me is not what I was told she was either. Behind them, metal screamed as the outer doors began to give way. Karan's eyes flicked off camera and back. 134 years, she said. Devon answered, for a misunderstanding. Then, because truth had finally stripped everything else away, he added the part that mattered most. Choose each other instead. The feed cut seconds later when the station doors blew inward. Chapter 7. History has a very bad day. At first, both states responded exactly as one would expect from regimes that had spent generations insisting they alone guarded truth. The federated face declared the transmission a Dominion deception, crudely fabricated by attention-addled enemy propagandists who had likely mistaken a podcast transcript for history. The Tick Dominion denounced it as a blue nostalgia deepfake assembled by emotionally manipulative archivists with too much time and not enough rhythm. Emergency filters buried the footage. State historians rushed onto official channels with expressions of grave confidence and suspiciously similar talking points. Comment brigades flooded networks with denial, outrage, memes, counter-memes, and at least one 6-hour documentary that somehow claimed the whole event had been staged by descendants of an ancient patio furniture cartel. But suppression had one major weakness. People had already seen the broadcast, and once an uncomfortable idea enters enough minds, no amount of official certainty can make it politely leave. A widow in a blue housing block replayed Quran saying, "He is not what I was told," and thought about the enemy prisoner her son once described in a letter as just some scared kid with acne. A Dominion field medic watched Devon, dusty and exhausted in the amber light, and could not reconcile him with the monstrous stereotype she'd been raised on. Archive clerks, signal pirates, black market coders, teachers, old skeptics, and bored teenagers with more technical ability than respect for authority began mirroring the recovered files faster than either side could erase them. Once the raw evidence escaped into thousands of underground caches, people did what people always do when official lies become too obvious to ignore. They got messy. Riots broke out, then strikes, mutinies, public refusals, mass walkouts, and furious acts of memorial vandalism. Recruitment stations burned, border garrisons hesitated, entire military units refused to fire. Priests of the feed cults denounced the archives as blasphemy and were answered in some places by congregants throwing folding chairs. The war did not end in one clean moment because almost nothing human ever does. It stuttered, cracked, relapsed, argued, and bled its way toward peace one betrayal at a time. Some commanders kept fighting because war was the only structure left in their minds. Some officials tried to preserve power by admitting only small portions of the truth and blaming dead subordinates. Some citizens preferred the old lie because it was emotionally tidier than discovering their ancestors had ruined the world over garbled corporate communications and an inability to calm down for 20 minutes. That might have been the cruelest part. If the war had begun over something grand, people could have mourned with dignity. If it had begun over resources or ideology or faith, at least the dead could be draped in the solemn cloth of tragic necessity. But to discover that generations had perished because someone misread crossed wires, because panic spread faster than verification, because executives said war room when they meant conference room, because no one involved had the moral courage to say, "Everybody stop and look at the actual file." That was humiliation on a planetary scale. It made people angrier than almost any atrocity would have, because atrocity at least sounded serious. This sounded like civilization choking to death on a stapler. Even so, truth kept spreading. Armistice councils formed, borders softened, shared memorials replaced triumph monuments. The old empires weakened, then fractured, then dissolved into something smaller and shakier and far more real. In the years that followed, school children would learn the names Karan Quill and Devon Venn, though their bodies were never conclusively recovered from the relay station. Some believed they died there. Some claimed they escaped into the scroll and lived quietly under assumed names, cultivating illegal vegetables and refusing every request to speak at commemorative events. A popular but highly dubious stage musical later depicted them as a romantic duet pair who saved humanity through eye contact and tasteful sarcasm. Historians hated the musical. The public loved it. This was generally considered proof that civilization, while improved, still had some work to do. Chapter 8. The final stupid twist. 16 years after the armistice, a restoration team excavating the lower relay vaults recovered one final corrupted file from the original April 18th archives. It was a voice memo recorded just before the now infamous crisis note was drafted. The speaker, a young contractor who sounded like he had slept maybe 3 hours that week and no longer believed in miracles, said, "Tell them it's just crossed wires between the FB and TK vendor layers. Also, for the love of God, someone please tell legal that war room is just an expression." In the background, someone else laughed. Then the clip ended. That was it. No mastermind. No hidden cabal unveiling some grand strategy of social annihilation. No coded declaration of hostile intent. Just one tired employee, one terrible day at work, one unfortunate use of office jargon, and a species already so conditioned for outrage that it could turn a formatting disaster into holy war. Historians later concluded that the phrase war room, appearing in leaked planning documents, had likely accelerated the initial armed mobilizations worldwide. In plainer terms, 134 years of mass death had been helped along by the fact that ancient corporations used dramatic meeting language to make themselves feel important. The revelation somehow made everything worse. People wanted tragedy to have dignity. They wanted catastrophe to wear boots and glare meaningfully from horseback. They wanted villains with operatic motives, not legal departments and software vendors and confused executives clustered around stale coffee in a conference room with a whiteboard still showing somebody's lunch order. Yet the restored societies kept the file public. They played it in schools, museums, and memorial halls, not because it honored the dead, but because it warned the living. Every generation had to hear how stupid it had all been. Every generation had to sit with the discomfort of knowing that civilization does not always collapse through dark genius. Sometimes it collapses through laziness, ego, sloppy communication, and a catastrophic refusal to extend patience before rage. That truth, humiliating as it was, turned out to be healthier than hero myths. And so each year, on the day of clarification, the rebuilt communities dimmed their public screens and gathered without banners, without allegiance colors, and without metrics. Families sat in courtyards. Strangers shared meals. Teachers read aloud the archived words, not the slogans of the old empires, not the propaganda, the warning. Ask one more question. Verify before fury. A stranger is still a person. No platform is worth a grave. In Concord, where one of the old blue monument plazas had been converted into a public garden, there stood a simple bench engraved with the last verified line from the transmission. Choose each other instead. People sat there quietly, sometimes beside strangers, which in the old days would have been considered suspicious behavior. Children asked what Facebook had been and why anyone cared so much. Adults would pause, search for a dignified answer, fail to find one, and usually say the only honest thing left. People were lonely, they would explain. People were proud. People got manipulated. And people forgot that being right online is not the same thing as being good. That was not a glorious ending. It was better. It was human, which, after everything, was the point. And that is how the longest war in human history finally ended. Not with the triumph of one side over the other, but with the humiliating discovery that the whole thing had begun because frightened people, reckless systems, and self-important institutions mistook confusion for destiny. If there was any mercy in it at all, perhaps it was this. After 134 years of ruin, two ordinary people looked at each other across the wreckage of inherited hatred and chose decency instead. No platform saved them. No algorithm redeemed them. No empire deserved them. Just two human beings in the dark telling the truth while the walls came down around them. And maybe that has always been the only way anything worth saving survives.
If this transmission found you, subscribe before the next one does.